So my next video will be the next installment for Super Ghost. We're up to Chapter 2, The Mountain Terror. Clammy mist swirled about the lone mountaineer as he picked his way down the stone-covered slope. Earlier in the day he had reached the cairn which stands on the summit of Ben Machui, the highest mountain in Scotland's Cairngorm range. As he began the return journey, a curtain of white fog descended upon him. With it came an eerie silence. The man moving cautiously in the mist was Norman Colley, a professor of chemistry at London University, and an enthusiastic climber. He felt no alarm at the sudden blotting out of the landscape. It had to be expected on Ben Machui. Having climbed the mountain before, he was confident that before long he would be enjoying supper in front of a log fire at his lodgings. Suddenly he paused. Through the eerie stillness came a faint sound. It reminded Professor Colley of a footstep, the crunch of someone stepping on the small stones which littered the slope. But that would be ridiculous. At the summit the view had been clear, and he would have noticed any other mountaineers in the vicinity. He was convinced he was the only one. Crunch? The professor knew that changes in temperature sometimes created a noise as rocks contracted or expanded, but such a sound was usually a sharp crack. No matter what explanation he could think of, he had to admit to himself that it could only be a footfall. There it was again. "This is nonsense," the professor muttered to himself as a pang of fear shot through him. He began to hurry as the sound of more footsteps reached his ears. He stopped and looked about him in the mist, but all he could see was a milky whiteness in each direction. Then as he walked forward again, the mysterious sounds became more distinct. "For every few footsteps I took, I heard a crunch," the professor was to relate afterwards. "And then another crunch, as if someone was walking after me, but taking steps 3 or 4 times the length of my own." He was seized with terror at the thought of something huge and unknown stalking him on the mountainside. He fled, racing down the slope, blundering into boulders which suddenly loomed up in the mist, and all the time aware of the crunching sound behind him. At last he emerged from the mist above the Rothy Murchis forest, and several miles from where he had begun his mad race. He was alone. Whatever it was that had inspired such panic in him was somewhere back in the mist. This episode took place in 1891, but it was not until 1925 that the professor told his story publicly at a meeting of the Cairngorm Club in Aberdeen. "Whatever you make of it, I do not know," he said, "but there is something very queer about the top of Ben Machui, and I will not go back there again by myself, I know." Reporters wrote about similar happenings which had been experienced on the mountain. One of the most interesting appeared in the Aberdeen Press and Journal, written by a Mr. W. G. Robertson, who had heard it from an old mountaineering friend named Henry Kellis. Henry and his brother Dr. A. M. Kellis, a very famous mountaineer who tragically lost his life on an Everest expedition, were below the summit of Ben Machui late one afternoon, when suddenly they saw a giant figure coming down towards them from the cairn. They saw it pass out of sight in a dip, and while waiting for it to reappear were attacked by the same feeling of panic as Professor Colley. "They were aware it was following them," wrote Mr. Robertson, "and tore down by Coir Etachan." Mr. Kellis said that there was a mist on part of the hill, but refused to believe that the figure could be the shadow of either his brother or himself. He asked why not 2 figures if that had been the case. No one who knew Mr. Kellis or heard him relate his story could doubt his complete faith in his experience. Since then there have been many reports of the Big Grey Man, as the apparition came to be named. A typical example of the terror which the Big Grey Man inspired occurred on the mountain in 1945. One morning in May, a mountaineer named Peter Densham, who had been employed on aircraft rescue work during the Second World War, set out from Abermawr and reached the summit of Ben Machui by midday. The weather was fine and clear, but as he ate his packed lunch, a heavy mist covered the mountain. For a while he continued to eat in the moist silence. Then he began to hear things, and remembered the strange tales. In the past he had not believed them, but now he felt that there was someone, or something, close to him. Then he heard a crunching noise from the direction of the cairn on his left. Peter Densham later recalled how his thoughts turned to the Big Grey Man and the sound of his footsteps were supposed to make. He was still not frightened, explaining that he thought the experience was interesting. But when the crunching was only yards away, he was engulfed by a wave of sudden panic, and all he wanted to do was get off the mountain. He began running wildly and realized that he was fleeing towards Lurch's Crag, a route which would end with him toppling to his death. He fought to hold his panic-stricken flight, but found it impossible. It was as though there was a murderous force pushing him onwards. With supreme effort of will, he managed to change direction. He raced down a ridge to the Altmoor Bridge and on past Glenmore, and only stopped running when he was on the other side of the loch. A fascinating story of an encounter with a big grey man, not just the sound of footsteps as given in Richard Frere's book, Thoughts of a Mountaineer. In order to win a bet with a friend of his, set himself an endurance test of spending a midwinter night camp beside the Ben Majui camp. During the night he awoke with a start of fear and a horrible sensation of being paralysed. As he lay still in his sleeping bag, his eyes focused on a white patch on the wall of his tent. It was caused by a ray of moonlight coming through an opening in the fly sheet, and as he watched, a blurred shadow moved across it. Something was close at hand and had moved between his tent and the moon. The man said afterwards that he felt he was in deadly danger, that whatever it was which had cast a shadow was hostile toward him. As he watched, the shadow vanished, and this in some way released the tension which was paralysing. Now his fear was mixed with curiosity, and inch by inch he crawled out of his sleeping bag, parted the opening of the tent, and gazed at the wild moonlit scene. At a distance of about 18 metres he saw a huge creature swaggering down a slope. It appeared to be covered with brown hair and had a head so large it was out of proportion to its body. The mountaineer was sure, he said, it was not some sort of ape because its arms were not long like those of a monkey. A few minutes later the figure vanished and the shivering man returned to his sleeping bag, trying to convince himself that what he had seen was a fellow climber wrapped up in his bulky alpine clothing. It seemed a pretty unlikely explanation, but it was the only one he could think of. When the sun rose over the Cairngorms, the man tried a simple but ingenious experiment to try and find out the height of the midnight prowler. There was no snow in the gully down which it had marched, so there would be no footprints to give him a clue, but the mountaineer remembered that he had not been able to see the creature's feet while it passed on a certain boulder which lay on the slope. This meant it had been on the other side of the rock. He paced out the distance and reckoned it to be about 23 metres from his tent, then planted his ice axe by the boulder and returned to the opening of the tent. When the creature's feet had been hidden by the boulder, its head still appeared silhouetted just above the horizon. By making a comparison between the length of the ice axe, which stood nearly a metre above the ground, and the line of the horizon, he was able to gain a rough indication of the creature's height. He said that he could not make it less than 8 lengths of his axe, and twice he made it 10, which meant that the figure was between 7 and 9 metres in height. It was exactly what he had thought at the time. A story of an enormous creature roaming an icy Scottish peak in the middle of winter may seem fantastic. Even more so is a description of an encounter with the big grey man, which appeared in the Scots magazine in June 1958. Here the author, a naturalist and climber named Alexander Tuinen, claimed that he had actually shot at it. It was 1943 when he had gone climbing in the Cairngorm Mountains in the hope of shooting some game to eke out wartime rations. On the afternoon he reached the summit of Ben Majui. Mist began to form in the pass below, and a rising wind moaned in the rocks about him. His mountaineering instinct told him that a storm was approaching, and anxious to avoid it, he began to descend by what is known as a Khoya Etachan track. It was when he reached the mist that he heard the footsteps with frightening long intervals between them. Suddenly Tuinen found himself gazing at a huge, shadowy shape looming up. For a moment it was hidden by the mist. Then it was visible again, coming straight for him. He raised his gun and fired 3 times, then took to his heels and raced down the path to Glenderry in a time he never betted. It would seem that the bullets did no harm to the big grey man, as sightings of him have increased since then. But the question remains, what is it that haunts Britain's second highest mountain? Could it be something like the Loch Ness Monster, which has survived from a prehistoric age? Is it the ghost of some such creature which returns to the mountain over which it once roamed? Or is it a personification of an evil force? It is an interesting point that those who have seen or heard the Big Grey Mountain admit to being filled with terror, and mountaineers are not easily frightened. Such an attack of fear was described by Wendy Wood in her book The Secret of Spey. She was on the lower slope of the mountain when she heard an enormous harsh voice echoing around her. She was too surprised to pick out the words, but she thought they sounded like Gaelic, the old language of the Scots. At first she looked for some natural cause. Perhaps it was a barking of a deer magnified by a freak echo. Then it seemed the sounds were coming from beneath her feet. She searched the snow in a widening circle in case an injured climber lay beneath it, and what she was hearing were his cries for help. She found no one, and the fear which she had been trying to keep in check suddenly overwhelmed her. Her only thought was to get away, and as she ran from the spot, she was certain that something sinister was following her. It was the same giant strides which had frightened Professor Colley. Stumbling desperately down the Lyriguru Pass, she fled from those crunching footsteps without stopping for breath until she found herself near Whitewall. Another woman to experience such a panic attack was a writer, Joan Grant. One fine summer day in 1928, she was walking with her husband in the Rothamachus forest, close to Ben Machui, when she was seized by a sensation of sheer horror. She turned and raced back along the path, with her husband running after her, demanding to know what was wrong. All she could reply was that they must run, faster. Afterwards she wrote that she knew that something evil was trying to reach her, and that if it did she would die. I had run about half a mile when I burst through an invisible barrier behind which I was safe, she said. I knew I was safe now, though a second before I had been in mortal danger. A year later, one of my father's professors described an almost exactly similar experience when bug hunting in the Cairngorms. He had been so profoundly startled that he wrote to the Times, and received a letter from a reader who had also been pursued by the thing. In her book Time Out of Mind, Joan Grant wrote of a sinister sequel to her experience when some years later the local doctor told her that Titus, for whom search parties had been out 3 days, had been found dead. He showed her the place on a large-scale map, and it was the exact spot where she had fled from the invisible menace. Both men were in their 20s and had spent a good night under what is known as Shelter Stone on the lower slope of Ben Machui. This was known because they had written their names and the date in a book which is kept there in waterproof wrapping. But after that, no one knew exactly what happened. Though it was easy enough to guess. The searchers found their bodies within 90 metres of each other, sprawled face down as though death had struck them in a headlong flight. The doctor told Joan Grant that he'd examined them, and never in his life had he seen healthier corpses. Not a thing to be wrong with either of them except the hearts had stopped. I put heart failure on the chip, the doctor said, but it is my considered opinion that they died of fright. So that is the next instalment of Super Ghosts.